4 months after selling everything I owned and moving to the Philippines, I booked a flight back to America. I didn't tell my daughter. I didn't tell my friends. I didn't tell anyone. At that point, I was convinced I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. The house was gone, the truck was gone, the furniture was gone. Everything I couldn't fit into 3 suitcases had been sold. There was no home waiting for me in Ohio, no garage full of tools, no backup plan. If this didn't work, I wasn't sure where I'd end up. What happened next is the only reason I'm still here today. My name is Mike. I was 67 years old when I made the move. I wasn't rich. I wasn't chasing some fantasy of living on a beach. I was retired, living on Social Security, a small pension, and about $210,000 from selling my house and everything in it. From the outside, my life looked fine, but every year things seemed to cost more. Every year another friend talked about putting off retirement. Every year I found myself saying the same thing. Maybe next year. Then one afternoon I was sitting at my kitchen table watching videos about people living in the Philippines. At first it was just curiosity. A few videos turned into dozens. Then I started running the numbers. The more I looked into it, the more it seemed possible. Not perfect. Possible. A few months later, I made a decision that scared me more than anything I'd done in years. I listed my house for sale. And once I did that, everything started happening fast. For months, moving to the Philippines had been an idea. Now it was becoming real. The house sold quicker than I expected. A few weeks later, I sold my truck. Then I started going through everything I owned, tools, furniture, kitchen stuff, boxes I hadn't opened in years. Some things were easy to get rid of. Other things weren't. One afternoon, I found an old photo album from when my daughter was little. I sat there looking through those pictures for almost an hour. For the first time, I started wondering if I was making a mistake. My daughter definitely thought I was. She wasn't angry, she was worried. Dad, what if you don't like it? What if something goes wrong? What if you want to come back? Those questions stayed in my head. The truth was, I didn't have great answers. I just knew that if I didn't try, I'd probably spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened. A few days before my flight, the house was almost empty. No couch, no dining table, no television. The rooms echoed when I walked through them. That night I sat on a folding chair in the middle of my living room and looked around. Maybe I should have put everything in storage. Maybe I should have rented the house instead of selling it. Maybe my daughter was right. Those thoughts kept me awake most of the night. But by then there was no turning back. My flight was booked. At first I planned to enter the Philippines as a tourist. I wasn't ready to commit to anything permanent. If things didn't work out, I wanted options. So I bought my ticket to Manila and an onward ticket out of the country to satisfy the airline requirements. My plan was simple: spend some time in the Philippines, learn what everyday life was actually like, then decide whether I wanted to look into something longer term, including the SRRV retirement visa. A few days later, I zipped up my last suitcase, locked the front door for the final time, and handed over the keys. After living in the same place for more than 20 years, that moment hit harder than I expected. Everything I owned was now sitting inside 3 suitcases, and I was about to fly halfway around the world. The trip itself felt like a blur. One flight turned into another. Airports, layovers, trying to stay awake, trying not to lose my luggage. By the time I finally arrived in Dumaguete, I was exhausted, but I was excited too. For the first time in a long time, it felt like I was starting a new chapter instead of repeating the same one. Before leaving America, I had arranged a furnished apartment For my first few months, nothing fancy. Just a simple place close enough to restaurants, grocery stores, and the waterfront that I could walk most places. The first few weeks felt almost exactly like I had imagined. Every morning felt different. Instead of looking out at the same street I'd seen for years, I was exploring somewhere completely new. I spent afternoons walking along Rizal Boulevard. I tried restaurants I'd never heard of before. I met other foreigners who had made similar moves. Some had been there for years, others had just arrived. Everyone seemed to have a story. For a while, it felt like I had made the right decision. The money side looked promising too. Back home, it often felt like every month got a little more expensive. In Dumaguete, I wasn't watching every dollar the same way. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't constantly worried about every bill either. At least, not at first. Looking back, I think I was still in vacation mode. Everything was new. Everything was interesting. The little inconveniences didn't bother me. If the internet went down for a while, I laughed it off. If something took longer than expected, I shrugged and moved on. I was still seeing everything through the eyes of a visitor. The problem was that I wasn't a visitor anymore. I lived there now. And somewhere around the second month, that realization started to hit me. The excitement was still there, but it wasn't as strong. The routine started replacing the adventure. I found myself calling my daughter more often. I started paying attention to things I hadn't noticed before. Little things that probably wouldn't have bothered me back in Ohio. One day I caught myself looking at photos of my old house, not because I missed the house, because I missed what it represented. Familiarity, routine, knowing exactly where I belonged. That was the first time I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Homesick. I hadn't felt homesick during the first month. Maybe I was too busy, maybe everything still felt exciting. But now there were moments when I wondered if I had made a mistake. At first those thoughts only lasted a few minutes. Then they started lasting longer. And by the fourth month, they were following me almost everywhere. By the fourth month, I wasn't thinking about America once in a while. I was thinking about it every day. Not all day, just enough that it started getting under my skin. One morning, my daughter sent me photos from a family barbecue. Nothing special. Just everyone together in somebody's backyard, kids running around, people laughing. The kind of thing I had seen hundreds of times before, but for some reason, that day hit me hard. I wasn't there. And for the first time, I started wondering how many moments like that I was going to miss. A few days later, one of my old friends called. We talked for almost an hour. When I hung up, my apartment felt quieter than usual. That's when I started noticing something. I had spent months building a new life, but I was still comparing everything to my old one, every day, without realizing it. If something went wrong, I thought about how it would have been easier back home. If the internet stopped working, I thought about Ohio. If I got frustrated, I thought about Ohio. If I felt lonely, I thought about Ohio. It wasn't really about America. It was about comfort. It was about familiarity. It was about knowing exactly what tomorrow was going to look like. One evening I sat down and started looking at houses online, just looking. At least that's what I told myself. Then I looked at apartments, then flights, then more flights. The scary part wasn't that I was looking. The scary part was how good it felt. For weeks I had been carrying around this feeling that something wasn't right. Looking at flights felt like an escape hatch. A way back to certainty, a way back to what I knew. A few nights later, I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I booked a flight. Just like that, a few clicks, a confirmation email, and it was done. I remember staring at the screen afterward. Part of me felt relieved, part of me felt disappointed. I had spent years thinking about this move, months planning it, sold almost everything I owned, flown halfway around the world, and now I was preparing to quit after 4 months. I didn't tell my daughter. I didn't tell my friends. I didn't tell anyone. I figured I'd wait until I got closer to the departure date. Then I'd explain everything. Maybe I'd tell them the Philippines wasn't what I expected. Maybe I'd tell them I missed home too much. Maybe I'd tell them I gave it my best shot. The truth was, I wasn't even sure myself. Over the next few days, I started mentally preparing to leave, and something strange happened. Instead of feeling better, I felt worse. The closer that flight got, the more confused I became, because deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to leave. I was just tired of being uncomfortable. And those are not the same thing. A few days later, something happened that completely changed the way I looked at everything. A few days after booking the flight, I was walking along Rizal Boulevard just before sunset. I didn't have any particular destination in mind. I was just walking, trying to clear my head, trying to convince myself I was making the right decision. The flight was booked. The plan was made. In a few weeks, I'd be back in America. At least that's what I kept telling myself. As I walked, I passed a small coffee shop I had been to a few times before. One of the other foreigners I knew was sitting outside. We had talked here and there over the previous few months. Nothing serious, just casual conversations. He waved me over and asked how things were going. Without really thinking about it, I told him the truth. I told him I was going home. I told him I had already booked the flight. I told him I didn't think this move was working out. He listened for a minute and nodded. Then he asked me a question I still think about today. How long did you spend planning this move? I told him almost 2 years. Research, videos, Facebook groups, budget spreadsheets, the whole thing. Then he asked another question. How long have you actually been living here? About 4 months. He laughed. Not in a rude way, just enough to make his point. Then he said something that hit me harder than I expected. You spent 2 years planning it and you're ready to quit after 4 months? I didn't have an answer. He took a sip of his coffee and shrugged. The first few months were the hardest for me too. That surprised me, because from the outside he looked completely settled, like he had everything figured out. Then he told me about his own first year. The homesickness, the doubts, the loneliness, the second guessing, the constant comparisons to home, everything I had been feeling. For the first time since arriving, I realized maybe I wasn't failing. Maybe I was just going through the same adjustment everyone goes through when they completely change their life. That conversation lasted less than an hour, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Especially one thing he said before we left. Don't make a permanent decision based on a temporary feeling. I must have repeated that sentence to myself 100 times over the next few days, because deep down I knew he was right. I wasn't running toward America. I was running away from discomfort. And those are two very different things. A few days later, I opened my laptop and pulled up the airline reservation. I stared at it for a long time. Part of me still wanted to leave. Part of me wanted to stay. The truth was, I was tired of going back and forth. I just wanted certainty. Then I remembered something. When I booked the ticket, I had added travel protection. At the time, it seemed like a waste of money. Now it was giving me another option. I called the airline. A few days later, most of the money was refunded. Just like that, the flight was gone. For the first time in weeks, I felt a little lighter. Not because all my doubts disappeared, because they didn't, but because I had finally made a decision. I wasn't leaving. Not yet. I gave myself 1 more month, 30 days. That was it. I promised myself that if things still felt wrong after another month, I could leave knowing I had given it a fair chance. No regrets, no what ifs. One more month. That month changed everything, not overnight. Not in some dramatic movie moment. It happened slowly, almost without me noticing. Instead of spending every day comparing the Philippines to America, I started paying attention to the life I was actually living. I stopped checking flights. I stopped looking at houses back home. I stopped asking myself whether I had made the right decision every single day. Something else happened too. I started building routines. Every morning I'd walk to the same coffee shop. The staff started recognizing me. I stopped feeling like a visitor. I started feeling like a regular. The same thing happened at a few restaurants. At the market, around my neighborhood, people started recognizing me, and I started recognizing them. That may not sound important, but it was. Back in Ohio, I wasn't missing my house. I wasn't missing my truck. I wasn't missing my furniture. I was missing familiarity. Now I was slowly creating that familiarity again. One day I realized something. I hadn't thought about my return flight in over a week. Then it became 2 weeks, then 3. The constant feeling that I had made a mistake started fading. Not because life suddenly became perfect, because it became normal. The Philippines stopped feeling like a place I was testing. It started feeling like a place I lived, and that changed everything. Today, when I look back on everything that happened, people usually ask me the same question. Do I regret selling everything? The honest answer is no. But that doesn't mean I would recommend everyone do it the way I did. Looking back, I probably should have put more things into storage. I probably should have given myself more options. Selling everything sounds exciting when you're talking about it. It feels very different when it's actually done. Once the house was sold, there was no getting it back. Once the truck was sold, it was gone. The life I had spent years building disappeared much faster than I expected. That's what scared me after I arrived. Not the Philippines, not Dumaguete, not the people. The thing that scared me was realizing there was no easy way back to the life I used to have. For a while, that feeling followed me everywhere. It was sitting in the back of my mind when I walked around town. It was there when I called family back home. It was there when I booked that flight back to America. What I didn't understand at the time was that I wasn't homesick for a place. I was homesick for certainty, for routine, for the comfort of knowing exactly what tomorrow would look like. The problem was that growth rarely feels comfortable. Starting over doesn't feel comfortable. Building a new life doesn't feel comfortable. And at 67 years old, I wasn't expecting to feel like the new guy again, but that's exactly what happened. The longer I stayed, the more I realized something important. I hadn't moved to the Philippines because life in America was terrible. I moved because I wanted something different. I wanted an adventure. I wanted to challenge myself. I wanted to see if there was more to life than repeating the same routine every day. The moment I stopped comparing my new life to my old one, things started getting better. Not perfect, just better. And better was enough. Today, I still have days when I miss family. I still have days when I miss familiar places. I still have moments when I think about the life I left behind, but I don't regret the decision anymore. If anything, I'm grateful I didn't get on that plane, because if I had, I probably would have spent the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I had stayed. So if you're thinking about doing something similar, here's what I would tell you. Give yourself time, more time than you think you need. A new country isn't going to feel like home after a few weeks, maybe not even after a few months. There will be good days, there will be bad days, there will probably be moments when you question the whole decision. That's normal. What isn't normal is expecting a completely different life to feel comfortable right away. Sometimes the hardest part of starting over is simply staying long enough to let it happen. 4 months after arriving in the Philippines, I was ready to leave. Today, I'm glad I didn't. And looking back, canceling that flight may have been the best decision I made after selling everything I owned.